All right, we're off and running. Lucas Johnson is here today. Lucas, thanks for joining me on the podcast with no name. This is literally a conversation between two people who've known each other for 6 or 7 years. I think I won't speak for you, but I think there's some mutual respect in terms of what each of us does in this environment. And I've essentially reached out to you to help us with something we deal with every day, which is how do we make this world that has been very confusing, and I'm going to summarize it as the world of building science and how it relates to how I can build better. And what happens as a business, we are now one that speaks more regularly to consumers than we do the trade. And the trade I would define as builders, architects, installation installers, and consultants. We have those conversations, but if we have 2 or 3 of those every day, then we have 10 with consumers. And what we find is that there's a large and increasing appetite for how to build better. And there is then a turn into a vortex that's very confusing for the person who's never done this before, or maybe they've done it once. And they would really like to learn about how to do the best they can do within whatever constraints they might have, right? And what we can say here is that not everybody has the opportunity to build with no budget. And so how do these people, because you and I come at this from the angle where we're in this discussion regularly and we've seen it evolve. You're going to take us back, way longer than me, 20 years. I can go back, I can stretch to half of that. But what we've seen, and the idea here, of course, is not to live in history, but what we've seen is that things have become more normal. Things have become easier to understand. Products have become more readily available, even though the people in the everyday trade don't get it. It's now not impossible for a consumer to go learn. And so I thought it would be really helpful for you and I to try and take what we experience every day and bubble that up into something that is easy to digest and tangible for people who are trying to build better. Let's simplify it right there. And then I think it's relevant for, you to include, recent developments in your working life and, what you're doing with Vali Homes, because in fact, you're trying to step into this void and help people. So I don't, with that as somewhat of an agenda, I would say that, if we come away with a 30-minute powwow where people can say, wow, that back and forth that Andrew and Lucas just engaged in can really help me think differently about my project.
Totally. I mean, I'd say that's a good way to summarize the goal of my career throughout it, is having people get to that moment of catharsis where it's realize that truly good approaches are actually fine for their budget and that they can basically break this cycle of myth that we have about building and get a truly good outcome, regardless of if they're rich or poor or somewhere in the middle, as long as we follow kind of a scientific approach. And, as you were speaking there, I wrote down a few notes, just kind of reflecting us meeting over, basically, I guess, a shared love for science and cocktails and trying to convince people to build better in the before times, and all the brainstorming we did and how that led to, various different things from, smart enclosure system to this whole concept of how do we speak directly to the people who are making these decisions? Because frankly, bringing up that Dave Chappelle thing recently, it was so beautiful to me to see someone speak directly to the audience, because that's the real power, the consumer, the audience, right?
Sure.
And that's who needs to know these things. That's how we change the market, is speaking directly to the people who are actually paying for this stuff. Frankly, and I one of my main things I want to stress is I don't want to blame any individuals. These are more structural issues than individual issues.
Sure.
But as an industry, the AEC professions, architecture, engineering, and construction, is quite bad at selling good building to people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We've been very bad. We've kind of failed at convincing people that this is how it should be done. And the most interesting part to me is that what I've noticed over 20 years and thousands of buildings, working with hundreds of professionals and whatever, is that green builders, or I like to call it good building now, good builders have a lot more fun. People that are working on good building, the clients, the professionals, they're enjoying their life more, both during the build and after the build. And one of my new sayings is fun replicates naturally. And what we need to do is spread the message to people that your whole point of building a house is to create this paradise to enjoy your life in, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole goal. And if that's our goal, why are we going to wrap ourselves in toxic ingredients and say that's okay because it saves a few dollars when we have that privilege and choice of building a custom home? Of course, with that clearly stated. I don't want to go too deep into it right now because I imagine you have some reflections, but one of the things I really want to make sure we emphasize during this is I think we've been chasing the wrong target for a long time. I don't think it's about performance. The data does not show that performance is our key metric. Good materials to build buildings with is the real goal. Having that available and having those materials available, having the professional resources available, having the full ecosystem, if you will, available to deliver truly good materials. Because another one of my sayings is the ingredients create the results.
Sure.
There's no magical formula that good design can turn bad building materials into a good building. If you're using something like spray foam, that's a bad building, even if it's a passive house. No matter what performance target you meet, if the building is made out of toxic high impact materials, I think it's kind of irrelevant. Like, cool, you saved some operational carbon, woohoo, like that's great. But if that meant packing on 300-year payback of embodied carbon to do it, so you don't actually help with the climate crisis at all, you just used a bunch of toxic stuff and used extra of it to get to a higher performance level that cost you more money and actually didn't help, that's kind of broken. And I think
I agree. I mean, you and I both participate in the Embodied Carbon Network, and I think, I won't speak for you, but one of my, one of the things that I latched onto early on was this notion of, we're going to let the sum of the parts be the calculator for defining the result, which and to take that one step further is we're going to use the best materials we can in the process relative to the given project. And if we do that, then what we get at the end should be reflective of the result that we were hoping to achieve versus, again, I don't think either one of us is here to give Passive House a hard time, but versus chasing a number and not focusing as much on how you actually get there. So you've got a performance figure of, less than 0.6 ACH 50, correct me where I'm wrong or off with those numbers. But how did you get to that figure and what kind of environment have you created by getting there?
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely how you deliver efficiency matters. We need at minimum carbon effective energy efficiency. Forget cost effective. At minimum, we need carbon effective energy efficiency, right?
Yeah.
Which means that the embodied carbon of the materials pays back in a reasonable timeline with the operational carbon savings delivered in your local climate with the context of the grid you're plugged into.
Yeah.
If you're net zero house or you're in Seattle, there's very little operational carbon savings available because the grid's mostly powered by renewables. So these things are, where you're building is extremely important in this conversation and these considerations. But no matter where you're building, you have to keep in mind, bringing it back to the total basics for, again, like the consumer audience, a building fundamentally is the enclosure system it is built out of. The performance of it, the mechanical systems, all that other stuff are elements that are added on to the building, right? So to clarify, by no means am I hating on Passive House. Passive House is amazing for energy efficiency. And Passive House delivered with truly good materials is the best building I'm aware of.
Yeah.
But not everyone can afford that. We have to acknowledge that. I certainly can't.
Yep.
Right. So we have to acknowledge that that's very expensive. And when we look at it holistically, from health, comfort, durability, life cycle carbon impact, social justice, all these things that really matter, we've put together a system we call the 5 factors of good building to look at these things. When we look at it at that level, it becomes pretty obvious that the materials make the biggest impact. What the building's built out of makes the biggest impact. Using a bunch more, say, foam insulation to get to a high efficiency standard isn't likely to have overall net positive outcomes.
Yeah.
It's likely to increase moisture failure risk. It's likely to increase net carbon impact, right? But we get to a higher level of performance. So in other words, the way we think about things and the kind of the approach we're calling the Valley way, or people have started calling it that, and we love it, is thinking about it as the materials first, right? That's what the building is. And then let's see what budget you have. And then we'll figure out what performance standard we get to, but we're never going to sacrifice the good materials.
Right. Cool. Okay. So let's do that. Let's stop there for a second. You said the process should be fun.
Yes.
Of course, I agree with that. That's a guiding principle in my life.
Yes.
We argue frequently in my house about which direction the fun compass is pointing in.
I've never been there. No.
Yeah. So that's always an enjoyable process. But I think, by and large, when people think about building, one, they can get easily overwhelmed. But then two, everyone's got my architect is the best. Oh, my builder's the best. And so there gets to be this word of mouth game, and I use this person. And then all of a sudden, we get this all the time, let me ask my builder if this is okay.
Yeah, totally.
And it's like, hold on a second. Mm-hmm. This is your house. You don't have to ask your builder anything.
Yeah.
If you make a decision about a material that you want in a structure. And I've got a lot of friends who are builders. And so again, nobody is here to speak in any kind of derogatory sense towards any elements of the trade. It's to try to highlight, what seems to be the ordinary case and help people navigate through it.
Absolutely.
And right. And so by making the process fun, you could start by using that as a guide for how you select an architect.
Sure.
How you select a builder. And, is this a stodgy firm that, is highly decorated and I'm just a cog in that wheel? Well, that might not be fun.
Yep.
Is this a builder that's at the top of their game and therefore gets to charge more than everybody in town? Like, they might have a playbook and you may not be successful in deviating very far away from whatever their norms are. So I'd love to hear some commentary on your views around some easy ways to make the process fun. And then, I think if you can do it succinctly, why don't you walk us through what those 5 factors are for good building so people can start to think about and understand, what direction their mind should be going in as they're, getting going with a project or thinking about taking one on.
Totally. Absolutely. And there's 2 main themes I hear in there is that there's a lack of fun and a lot of confusion in the market. The confusion we'll address second, the fun I'll speak to first. In, again, that Vali Homes kind of approach, we view the industry as an industry where there's tables being built with 3 legs, right? There's architecture, engineering, and construction. That's 3 legs. A table can stand with them. But the 4th leg of the table is science, right? And building science is currently delivered mostly as a side hustle through the AEC industries, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, there's a deep tie of science to sales and sponsorship, which is where I think a lot of the confusion stems from, because it's really hard to figure out what information you can trust. And
well, look, and we're a perfect example.
yeah,
I'm certainly not here to talk about Havelock wool, but there's a very real interjection worth making, which is, we followed the so-called traditional paths to market by meeting with architects and builders and trying to get specified, and that's what material manufacturers do, and it didn't work for us. And so we figured we had a product that people would be willing to talk about. In fact, we
that's why
found
we had so many cocktails together on
right,
the road, actually, because that was
exactly. And we sort of found that people wanted to talk about it more than we did, to be honest. And so, a couple things happened. One is we realized that, and two, if we didn't want to go out of business, we appreciated that we better start talking to the people who were going to be the ultimate users of our product.
Yep.
Because that was our best opportunity to actually end up in the structure.
Completely.
And when we made that decision, I don't know, 2.5 years ago, our entire business changed. And that's why we now live in this consumer discussion. And that's why we're having this conversation, because we're trying to make this complex world less complex for them. And I think we've got a long way to go, but we got to start somewhere. You've just given us an amazing background for these 5 factors. So if you're up for it, walk us through them, and, then we can leave it there, and see if anybody's interested in listening to this commentary. And if they are, there's no question that, you and I could, take this a lot farther. So if you're up for it, I'd say let's pile in there and give people some things, to think about, as they dig into whatever their project might be.
Absolutely. No, that's I mean, this is my favorite subject of conversation. I feel incredibly lucky that my what do they say? Your vocation's your advocation or whatever.
Yeah.
I love what I do, right? And getting to talk about this. So I'm always happy to do this. 5 factors of good building is a design tool that I've put together over 20 years of doing this work, over 10,000 projects or so, and seeing where this industry is most broken and trying to figure out a quantitative way to fix that is a way that I could try to explain it most generally. And what I mean by that is, I'll start with this. I'll just do this for 2 seconds. There's this thing called the 2 horses story. And basically the idea is, and this may be myth, it may be real, that at some point a Roman emperor specified that roadways need to be 2 horses wide for a war chariot, right? And basically ever since then, that's been the universal width of a lane of a road, right? And to the point where space shuttle components are 2 horses wide because they need to be able to go down 1 lane of a freeway, right? So it creates this, like, we have these reiterative things that occur throughout society that we stop questioning once they become habit, once they become part of our culture, right?
Yep.
So the whole idea is we need to break our culture around product specification. Right now we look at efficiency, and we think of efficiency as this proxy for good building. But when we first designed the idea of good building, it was about health. It was about the 5 factors. So here, I'll tie them in now. The 5 factors were health, right? And comfort, their durability, their life cycle carbon impact, there's social justice, and of course, there's efficiency and renewables. That's certainly one of the factors. The problem is that efficiency was the one that was easiest to quantify. So we started paying attention to efficiency, perfecting efficiency, and kind of assuming the rest of the stuff was being pulled along with it, that an efficient building was comfortable and healthy and durable. And we had a lot of confirmation bias in the research done to show that was happening. And what we've ended up with is a bunch of buildings that have high performance standards that aren't necessarily good places to live for people from a health standpoint, from a durability of your investment standpoint, from a lot of different standpoints, we've kind of failed our market. And again, not individual problems, structural problems, but we can break that. I think my hypothesis, I guess, is that we can break that broken cycle by helping quantify the other elements. And the 5 factors of good building is a system that allows us to quantify products, like insulation materials, airtightness, or full projects, like a given building. We can give a score based on hundreds of points of performance in the background across those 5 factors that go through a weighted average process and output a score.
Yep.
My master's thesis happened to be on like how to basically take subjective environmental stuff and turn it into objective quantifiable systems. So that ended up being one of those things where you're like, I'm never going to use this. And you come back to it 20 years later in your career and you're like, hey, that education came through for me.
Yeah. Way to go. So Lucas, can you just list out 1 through 5 real quick so it's clear for people?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good idea. One more time. So comfort and health.
Yep. They go together.
Yes, they're the first factor.
Okay.
They got combined so that we could allow room for social justice.
Yep.
And frankly, that should have been part of it from the beginning, but my privilege or whatever prevented me from seeing that. And we realized it's our bad. And we feel a little nervous about that factor because the data isn't as clear because we haven't collected as much data about social justice in building products. But what's really clear is there's some building products that require workers to be exposed to toxic conditions where they're not paid fairly to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I understand.
So for us, we've just created more of an index approach of like, is this abusive to laborers in most cases?
Right.
Do they have to?
So sorry, I interjected from the top.
No, yeah. So but that's very, very, very important to
absolutely
clarify. And again, like social justice needs to be in there, but that's still the most gray area factor where we're working on getting more help because frankly, we're not the right people to be designing that factor.
Yep.
We care about it. We want to normalize the conversation. That's the intent, right? All right. So going from the top, comfort and health.
Yep.
Durability.
Yep.
Because buildings should last at least 100 years. Like we have that capability. And if 300, 500 years is really more what I'm excited about. Yep. And durability along with that is resilience. So durability and resilience. Right.
Resilience being, Lucas, like it'll stand the test of time without a whole bunch of, of course, standard upkeep, but not like, redoing it every 50 years so it lasts 150 years.
Totally. Or designing a sacrificial cladding system that's easy to redo and low carbon impact to pull off the siding and put it back on. Yeah. Because we know that'll fail, but the core of the building lasts for hundreds of years, right?
Got it.
That's or building service cavities in the building. So when we want to remodel, we don't actually have to cut deep into the walls. We just pull off the finish, rerun all the plumbing and electrical we want to, pop finishes back on. That's cool. Resilience for the building, but the building also needs to be resilient within the context of we don't know what the F is going to be happening with our climate.
Right. Totally.
So there's also that level of resilience too.
Cool.
And yeah, so there's durability and resilience, and then there's efficiency and renewables. So, passive house is the highest level of efficiency I'm aware of. So that's like your 10 out of 10 on that one, right? Yeah. And then renewables, what level of on-site renewables, what type, et cetera, et cetera. Are they appropriate for the local context? These are the kind of questions that get answered or asked throughout the process. Yep. Then there's something we call embodied injustice, or more clearly, we're borrowing that term from the culture anthropology world, embodied injustice. That's used for more societal issues, but say like police infrastructure. But we are applying that to things like spray foam, where in that product life cycle, there's war for oil, there's crashing through icebergs to find oil, there's creating big chemical plants that that toxify communities.
Right.
Whatever, right. There's inextricable elements of that product life cycle that cause violence to humanity. And to me, that's fundamentally, basically for that score, it's kind of like you're a 1 or you're a 10. Like it's a pretty,
Right.
there's not much in the middle, to be fair, unfortunately, in that world. You're tied into this like basically completely unfair structure to humanity, or you're not. And then the fifth factor is, of course, life cycle carbon, embodied carbon, right?
Yep.
And the way I explain that to people is usually just think through the process behind a product before it gets to your house, right? When it's foam, we have oil and the whole process of oil. We have big chemical, the whole process of big chemical, and all of that's mixed together on your site, right? Or before it gets to the site and then mixed together again on your site to create spray foam, right? So inextricably, it's connected to industries that I think most people who are interested in good building would not want to support actively. But we get tricked into supporting it because we're like, oh, it's high R value and it's going to get us to this performance target, and performance is what matters. Don't get me wrong. Again, I have to always clarify this. Performance matters, but performance is secondary to what materials you use to deliver that level of performance. We have to require good materials, and from there, we can get to as high of performance as we can, and we should. It's our duty to the future of humanity to use good materials and then take them to whatever level of performance we can afford. But we need to be a lot more inclusive. It's really unfair to say everyone needs a living building challenge passive house. I've said that before. I've said I wish everyone had one many times. It's a wish because there's no effing way I can afford one. So, yeah. So the 5 factors process is about breaking this assumption that efficiency is what really matters and trying to quantify what we really care about and use that quantified scientific process to make these decisions around what insulation am I using, what air tightness materials and systems am I going to use, what kind of water control system am I using, what framing am I using. Maybe this helps justify minimizing concrete in your foundations, right? Like whatever it's applied to, the idea is just to provide more data for people to make that decision in the design process.
Right.
And it can't be a certification because certification systems have a perverse incentive towards giving the certification, or else the organization goes out of business.
Right.
And that's not, again, not individual. That's a structural issue.
All right. Well, listen, I think we should cut it here. Of course, make any closing arguments.
Well, that was my close.
Okay, you're done. That's great. That's easy. I think that, like I said, when we were, catching up at the start, I've got a goal here, which is to help people understand this world, which seems as if it might be extremely complex when in reality it's not. You just need a couple places to go and get answers to your questions. We try to do that effectively in insulation. That is one very small component of a large puzzle. But I firmly believe that these walls can be broken down. And if we can do that for the consumer, I think that is how we can affect real change in the industry.
And I guess it comes down to, you need science, right? You either need to follow the scientific process yourself as the consumer, or you need to hire a scientist to help you do that.
Totally.
But we need science as the fourth leg of the table.
We need that. It's a wonderful way to describe it. We need science, and then, we need transparency too. And people need to be willing to share the data.
Well, real science is transparent. We aren't like that. Sorry, I was wrong. Here's the one thing I have to say. We aren't really delivering true science in the building science world, in the sense that there's very little real world confirmation of what we model, right? The lab testing is a long way from perfect. I mean, it's really hard to simulate real world conditions, but there's certainly a lot of bias, right, in the way that data is collected and processed and done. Because really, science isn't funded directly in the construction industry. Science is almost always as a side hustle, or it's like, we're a scientific newsletter, so we do some research on the side but we're paid by, sponsored by a bunch of companies so we can do this newsletter. Wonderful effort. That's amazing. That's great. But you're a newsletter company. You're not a science company at that point, because science needs to have very, very, very minimized and actively managed bias.
Yeah, it needs to be independent. Sure.
It needs to be its own thing. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to do with Vali Homes right now, is decouple building science from the AEC world and have building science really be its independent own thing that's paid for directly by homeowners, developers, et cetera, as their main representative to say, this is the truth. This is the data. This is where, help them with that part. And then all they have to do is use their intuition and see if that lines up with the data. And that, circling it back, is how we make it fun. Because the scientific research for most people sucks. They don't enjoy it. Me,
that's true.
I freaking love it.
Yeah. Well,
right. Business partner, I love it. I know you love it too. So like what we need, and I just think that hasn't existed. People haven't had, and even like for my last 5 years, I spent at 475, which is a wonderful company, and I had a great time there and everything. But the challenge was I was always involved with projects very quickly, and there's always a perceived bias of what I'm saying because my income depended on people buying products.
Right.
That was understood. That was communicated. I tried to be as transparent about it as I could, but that still does like, imagine the next step. I learned about these awesome new products. You're the builder. Pretend I'm the builder. I'm going to my homeowner client and I'm like, hey, I learned about all these awesome new products. I got all specified. It's awesome. And they're like, oh, did you get that from a scientist? No, I got it from a product rep.
Right.
And as the homeowner, you're kind of like, now my feeling and the data don't seem to line up. That's strange, right?
Yeah.
So what we're trying to offer is that, oh, I got this advice from a scientist who only cares about what the data says.
Yep. Cool. Well, that's a great place to leave it. Lucas, as ever, enjoyed the chat. Thank you for doing it. And I suspect we might aim at doing it again.
If so, I can't wait. Always a pleasure. And I just hope this has been useful for the audience. And we're just excited to help, continue to grow this movement.
Right on. Thanks, Lucas.
Yeah, absolutely. Right on, man.